This image of Stratford-on-Avon, the Anne Hathaway cottage, which has been preserved, represents the evolution that began in the 1400s in England with the beginning of what we call the housing revolution. At the point at which folks in the British Isles began to build real substantial houses, they have developed a system of braced framing with heavy timbering, with plaster between the timbers, the reason being they were beginning to run out of wood. England is not very big, and when you think of the ships for the King's Navy, as well as the wood being consumed not only in the housing revolution, but also for purposes of heating and cooking. As a way to economize on the use of wood, they developed the heavy timbering system that you see on this example in Lincoln. Little buildings. This is a reproduction that I found in Rhode Island. Clear it wasn't just a garden shed. Somebody was seriously trying to replicate early English braced frame construction, and even with a thatched roof and a very high peak. This is the recreation done in 1930 of early Puritan housing. Salem was one of the first communities settled along with Boston on the eastern shore of Massachusetts. So they show a very heavily thatched roof, a chimney, and they use plaster inside and out, and it's going to be dried out by the smoke, and it has to be repaired and rebuilt on a fairly frequent basis. But that kind of chimney construction was responsible for the destruction by fire of a lot of early cabins. Williamstown, New Hampshire, and now what we see here is the major difference is that the exterior is now cladded, in this case with shingles, because it didn't take long for the Puritans to discover that while the average climate temperatures between central and northern England and New England are similar, the weather is extremely different. We have much, much hotter summers and much colder winters with lots of snow, and they discovered that the exterior plastering, which had served pretty well in England, failed here. So they quickly covered structure with local shingles and quickly moved to clapboarding as well. You see too that the roof has now moved to wood shingles and thatch had been given up. Thatch was given up in the colonies around the 1650s. The Peak House survives in Medford. The Peak House is an interesting historical artifact because we know from documentation that it was built in 1680. The fellow who had been living on this site was a victim of the Indian marauding accompanying King Philip's War, and Medford was on the frontier at that point of Massachusetts, and his house was lost to fire. So they came back and rebuilt the house on the same foundation, just as they'd remember it being. Now here we see an evidence of some diamond pane glass in the windows. Basically windows didn't have glass. The colonies were prohibited by England from manufacturing glass, although we had all we needed here to do it, because England wanted to keep control not only of glass manufacture, but lots of other industrial production, so that we would ship supplies to them, they would return manufactured goods, and of course we would pay. So this is in Dedham, the Fairbanks house. But when you come around to the front facade, you see this very irregular arrangement of windows. The windows themselves are replacements. Would have been put in about 1700 when the double-hung sash could be made. We had the milling machinery to do it, and it was in fashion, and virtually every building made the transition to double-hung sash. And you see here clapboarding, the very steep pitched roof, and the centered chimney, centered above the center entrance house. This is the old Jackson House in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Again, characteristically steep roof. But an example of the lean-to, which is in these early houses added. When you see lean-tos on houses in the 18th century, they're very often integral to the original construction of the house. In this case, it's an add-on, and you can see the updated windows here. Abraham Brown House in Watertown. And it has this wonderful original door. Doors and windows don't get saved. When you hear the phrase dead as a doornail, it comes from this, because these are vertical planks which are then nailed through to horizontal planks behind, which makes a door impervious to Indian attack. When a nail was pounded through both boards, make it impossible for it to be pulled out, and that's called deadening the nails. This is an example of what that heavy timber framing would look like on the inside. This is the Whipple House in Ipswich. Now, the tree trunk, which each one of these posts was a tree, And this is upside down. They're using the widest portion of the tree toward the ground as to create enough surface up here to carry not only this beam running this way, which is a girt, but there's a shoulder here to carry this horizontal beam that runs across the room, which is called a summer beam. It comes from the French, soumier, to carry a burden. This is floor plan of the Israel Arnold house, but early settlements were land hungry. They wanted farmland and they wanted to be on it. So they had an opportunity to orient the house south, and they, with a little tinge to the west, which they quite frequently did, to collect the greatest amount of thermal heat from the sunshine through the greatest quantity of windows, which meant that the back was where the cold wind was, the north. So there was always a large fireplace in the kitchen. This is the fireplace that was kept going usually day and night, and in the coldest room. Made a lot of sense. So in the front, on the warmest face, you do not have a fireplace. It's only the 3-run rise of the stair, and then fireplaces in the other rooms, both on this floor and the upper floor, will have fireplaces. This is a typical carryover medieval chimney, built in sections. This house is a wonderful document because it's dated 1683 on the summer beam, carved in by the builder, and built as the parsonage for the First Parish Church. This is the house in Salem. This is the John Ward house of 1684. So they picked up this building off its original foundation and moved it to the backyard of the Essex Institute and restored it. And lo and behold, what they have looks a lot like the Parson Capon house in Topsfield, with the overhanging second story, which was all the fashion in England in the 1690s. Any slight overhang, it was a way on narrow streets to get more space out of your second floor. You had to maintain a nominal street widths, but you could encroach on its airspace. So as a fashion statement, it comes to the colonies. So here you see the Ward house with its windows restored. But most radically is the restoration of these great wall dormers, which the roof framing indicates had always been there, but they had, of course, been stylistically removed, doubtless in the 18th century. Now you see, you can't make it out quite in this picture, but there is no symmetry to this facade. There's much more space over here than over here. The dormers are, yes, the same size, and both cover 2 windows, but not, the measurements are whatever they want them to be. The House of Seven Gables in Salem, made famous by Nathaniel Hawthorne in his House of Seven Gables. Now here's the old house. This is the house from the late 1600s, and there's the great wall, one of the great wall dormers, as we saw in the Ward house. This is the entrance porch for the original house, and then beyond this is an added wing. There would have been another wall dormer just like this on the other side, and the whole face of the house would have been facing the river. Now, when Mr. Turner became a merchant of means, he added this whole piece to it. And if you can see, the floor levels don't line up because he wants higher ceilings than these early houses provided. Here's another survivor, Cooper Frost Austin house. But again, that chimney done in multiple flues and not a square block is very typical carryover medieval feature. Do you see how the siding width decreases as you get down toward the base? Why they did this, we don't know. But it apparently aesthetic, done repeatedly on very early houses. Well, there were other stylistic winds blowing. We are looking at Whitehall Palace, done by Inigo Jones, who was the teacher of Sir Christopher Wren. Inigo Jones was the first architect in England to bring back Renaissance ideas from France, but principally from Italy. And after all, France was building Versailles, and the King of England wanted something equally noble, so Whitehall Palace was commenced. It was never finished. But this piece of it got built in what was the latest fashionable Renaissance style. What we're looking at when we look at architecture derived from antique classical sources, Rome particularly, it's a set piece. It's there to impress you. It's proportional. There's nothing casual or unthought out in this design. The purpose of this room is of a single ballroom, but they've made it to look in every convincing way like a 2-story space. So it's presenting immediately upon its face a falsehood. And you see how the columns, when you read your Vitruvius and so forth, a Roman architect who wrote, you discover that when you stack columns, this is an Ionic column, with an Ionic entablature, and you place another column upon it. You must rise through it. Don't rest one upon an open space. So that grids the facade, you see, creating horizontals and verticals that are quite rigid. And then this must be a finer capital than this. So we have Ionic here, and above it is Corinthian. And then when we run through the balustrade above, note that the stiles are all placed above a column, and the rails are just to add another horizontal sense to it. If Gothic architecture tends to be vertical in its spirit, and we see it that way in churches a lot, because Gothic architecture is quite compatible with churches, we see it all the time, we see classical architecture used in public and civic buildings, and it usually presents a much more horizontal aspect. This is reconstructed palace for the governor at Colonial Williamsburg, built in the early years of the 1700s, and then rebuilt after it had been supplanted by a high school, the early years of the 20th century, and that got cleared away when Rockefeller's money came. But my purpose in showing it is that you see the sense of medieval informality has completely disappeared. The placement of these windows is to a rigid pattern. Please notice that the windows in the dormers are exactly placed above the windows below, and the space announced by this window and its balcony is directly above the main entrance. So the transition begins in New England. Prince starts in institutional architecture and moves later to domestic. But this fine 1823 print, it's called the Burgess print, is of Harvard's campus. What we have here on of the original Harvard Yard are three buildings. On the left we have Harvard Hall, built in 1677. Now we see clustered windows, great wall dormers, clustered chimneys. It's been brick, of course, but this is basically a late medieval building. In the middle is Stoughton Hall of 1699. Now you see the rhythm of the windows has been pretty much regularized, much along the pattern that we saw at Colonial Williamsburg. And the dormers are sort of oriented to the window openings, not quite, and the clustered chimneys remain. But then in 1720, Harvard builds Massachusetts Hall. This is a thoroughgoing Renaissance building or post-medieval building. The windows are very regularly patterned. They borrow the door arches from Stoughton, its neighbor, just to tie the aesthetics together. But you can see by this end wall particularly that there is a certain rhythm and regularity to the spacing of these windows. This is in Ashley Falls, built in about 1750. And you can see that now, even in rural places, the unlettered farmer is able to create, or have created for him, very symmetrical and clean design. This fit not only the requisites of Renaissance design and current fashion, it also tied very well into the New England desire to create a organized, composed, thrifty, not very decorated, but aesthetically pleasing object. From these roots that the Shakers developed their designs and continued them well into the 19th century. Now we're in love with Shaker design, but in fact its roots are this. This is the Hartwell Tavern. This is on the Concord-Lexington Battle Road National Park. You can see the massive chimney in the center. This has been preserved, restored and preserved by the National Park Service. Next door was the Hartwell House. It unfortunately burned before the Park Service ever acquired this property. It was functioning as a restaurant. And all that was left after the fire, this was in the 1960s, all that was left after the fire was the great chimney stack. When the Park Service came along in the 1980s, they said, you know, we really ought to save that chimney stack and build a protective shelter around it. Since the foundation was still there, they went ahead and recreated the original framing of the house as it would have been. And when we look back at the same building when it's been clothed, it all works. You can imagine what the skeleton frame here is that makes this is the box, so it carries on. But now it's been regularized. This is the Sandown meeting of 1780, beautiful double hung sash that are original, and a fine panel door inside, a rather well executed classical portico and pilasters, a little free interpretation of a capitol. But I want to point out, you see that the width of this space is equal to the height of that window. And then it's repeated and repeated right along is again exhibited in this house. And this is a high-style house in Wollaston. The house is from the late 1700s, and you can kind of tell a 1700s house, Georgian style, by the caps over the windows. But again, you see that same rigid design philosophy, and this nice Chippendale balustrade at the top tells you what kind of furniture was probably inside. This is the Lady Pepperell house. Colonel Pepperell was the colonial hero who launched the attack on Fort Louisbourg in the French and Indian Wars. And he was lost in the battle, but his wife inherited the fortune, and Lady Pepperell built this house in 1760, and this is the way it appears today. The windows have been restored in a high-style Georgian manner. This pavilion has been pulled forward and given its own pediment. This house would be very at home as a small stately home in England. Now this is a nice cutaway drawing of the interior of a great Georgian house. Main entrance is here, with in this case, and in the case of all these high-style Georgians, the hallway runs all the way through the building. And here you see the stairway rising up to the second floor, and under that stairway where you can't see it is the doorway out to the back. So here's the main parlor. Behind it is the gentleman's library. Then across the hall we have the dining room and the ladies' withdrawing room. The Jeremiah Lee house in Marblehead, served by 2 major chimney stacks and lots of fireplaces. It's 3 full stories. This house was so large that when Marblehead became a small village, this became the town bank. So this is your basic garden variety Georgian house with this nice little pedimented entrance and a fan light and the rigid proportions of the window layout, and so a center chimney. This house is in Newport, near Trinity Church in Newport, Rhode Island. And this is the one in Brooklyn, Connecticut. This is a federal house. We're now into the 19th century. And we have a large fan light. The same patterning of windows, because remember, we're still in the box. We can't really break this design. We've got this frame in here. But what has happened to the building is it's increased in size. 2 chimneys now, one for a chimney stack feeding that's placed in the middle of the building, which feeds fireplaces front and back for this room and for this, and the same for the bedrooms upstairs. So we now have a center hall colonial, which is not colonial, it's now we're states, but with 2 chimneys. So when you see the 2 chimneys on a building, you know that the center hall runs all the way through. They're still practicing the diminution of the siding as you get down toward the foundation. Now the corner boards are pilasters, indicating an understanding of classical architecture. But the real federal architecture gets kicked off by Charles Bulfinch. In 1796, Charles Bulfinch was building this house for his contemporary and friend, Harrison Gray Otis. This is the headquarters of the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities on Cambridge Street, now known as Historic New England. And what we see here done by Bulfinch, not only do we have very high ceilings and gracious rooms, what we have is now the influence of French Revolution. We were going to take architecture back to its basic elements, that is pure geometry. So you see this almost undecorated cube, which is considered to be one of the fine forms like the circle and the sphere. And we should build our architecture from these plain and simple forms. So that's why this building is so undecorated on the exterior, but very rich on the inside. It didn't take long for Samuel McIntyre, the famous carver in Salem, to begin to copy Bulfinch, and he built the Gardner Pingree house for the Gardner family in 1804, the height of the federal period, with a nice McIntyre porch. This is Gore Place in Waltham. Gore was governor of Massachusetts, but at the time, Gore was our representative to the United States government in Paris. And while he was serving in Paris, his house burned down, and they sent him word, and he said, well, that's distressing. I'll send you plans, and you can build one, and when I get home, I'll have a new house. So for many years, we believe that this design was done by Charles Bulfinch, because it's got all his earmarks with these fan lights and nice curved openings and red brick and white trim. Subsequent research discovered that Ambassador Gore in Paris had made friends of J.G. Lagrange, who was a Parisian architect who designed this. One of the things that the federal period introduces is the concept of the oval room. The oval room is the height of fashion, and here we see that Gore has not 1 but 2. The Oval Room is, of course, associated with the Oval Office in the White House, because an Oval Room was installed in the White House after the British burned the White House in 1814. And he wasn't through there. Look at this wonderful sweeping staircase the craftsmen were able to do without either the architect or the owner on site. Most federal building, however, gets expressed, when it's expressed in brick in cities, in the row house, which got built as worker housing in those towns that were springing up in response to the Industrial Revolution. These all used to look alike. And you can see how each of these units are side hall plans. That is to say, the entry's here. You enter here, there's a stairway to the second floor, and then this would be the master bedroom. Parlor's down here. This is what we call a side hall plan, 3 bays across. An old postcard, bird's eye view of Cornhill, Brattle, and Court Streets, Boston. This is, of course, where urban renewal happened in the 1960s. You can see that Boston was indeed left a city of brick by Bullfinch, all red brick and white trim. And the urban renewal project wiped out 22 blocks of streets and replaced them with 7. Now this facade all still exists, so you can see how our cities utilized brick in the federal period. Newburyport preserves a lot of federal work. Then they had a great fire in 1811 that destroyed the whole downtown. And so they rebuilt all in one style, all in one set of proportions, all with a consistent cornice line throughout the town. So Newburyport has come down to us with a legacy of a great amount of commercial federal architecture. Let's look at the introduction to the Greek Revival. This is a drawing of the Parthenon done up on strict proportions. This is the Doric order, correctly interpreted from the Parthenon as it would look if it had come down to us intact. Drawings like this took a long time to get. European architects principally had long gone into Italy and drawn and sketched and recreated buildings based on Roman ruins. But Greece was off limits to them because the Turks controlled Greece and they were not interested in the invasion of European intellectuals. So they didn't get there. But when the Greeks threw off the Turks in the 1820s, the archaeologists and the architects poured in. And we came back with these wonderful Greek designs. And they quickly got interpreted into three-dimensional architecture. I'm showing you the capital of Virginia, but in fact, this is Roman architecture based on Greek models. So we see the pediment stretching all the way across the narrow end of the building, creating kind of that Greek temple look. But it didn't take long for real Greek designs to be incorporated in our architecture. This is a doorway street on Beacon Hill in Boston, and you can see all this wonderful leaded side lights to the windows and correct Greek Ionic columns, not Roman, supporting a wonderful marble entablature and so forth. Now notice, the ellipse has disappeared. You normally would want to see a fan light over the door. Not if you're dealing with pure Greek sources, because the arch was unknown to the Greeks. It had been created by the Etruscans, and so the Romans knew it, but the Greeks never worked in it, so it has to disappear. The typical Greek Revival house around the New England countryside looks kind of like this. This is a house in Sterling. It's a side hall plan, you see. We've got the main parlor here with long, tall windows, and the major entrance here with side lights. Enter here and go upstairs. Master bedroom will be here. In this case, Doric columns with a plain entablature and a rather steep roof. Not all Greek buildings need to have pediments. This is the Charles Lee house in Barry. This was designed by Worcester's prominent architect in this period, Greek Revival and later, named Elias Carter. It was the house for Charles Lee, and then Elias Carter built another house in Templeton for his brother. So this house, at the time I photographed it, was happily unoccupied. It was for sale. So I'm peeking in the windows and it's unfurnished. And it shows us this Greek Revival interior. Now what Elias Carter has done here is given Charles Lee a double parlor, the height of fashion in the Greek Revival period. In this case, the double parlor extends across the front of the house. In other words, the columns we looked at before are here. And the entrance, the main entrance, is not. But this room is duplicated in this room. Now notice that the delicacy of the federal has disappeared. We're dealing with flat, plain forms now in the Greek Revival, which are more correct to Greek sources. But this delicate swags, which were of course used a lot by Bullfinch, and remind us of Wedgwood work on China. Wedgwood created his factory in these early years, the 1800s, and replicated this then fashionable work on his porcelain, which continues right to this day, because it never really went out of fashion. So this is the Augustus Eager house, And this house stands in Westminster on the Old Common and is another interpretation of the Greek Revival. Here in this case, the pediment is huge, covering 2 stories, and giving 5 bays across on the first floor, 3 windows above, placed correctly above the windows below. We find these houses, what I'm not showing you in this picture, and I wish it did depict, is that this house, for all the width of its facade, is only 1 room deep. There's a very shallow ridge here. I mean, it doesn't extend back very far. The Greek Revival here interpreted on a Cape Cod house, entirely unlikely. It is a Cape Cod house, there's no doubt about it. Center entrance, 1 story, and all the rest. But it's all tricked out in Greek Revival, including a nice wide entablature over the corner boards, which serve as columns. This is also in Salem. Just a very well-dressed example of a small house in the Greek Revival. And you see these interesting corner blocks over this entrance? So we know they're A, original, and B, truly authentic to the Greek Revival. As cities became larger and industry populated those cities and in fact changed them into dirty, noisy, smelly places with railroads, people with money wanted a country retreat. They wanted to escape the city. And so the country villa, and with it the American suburb, was invented of this, what we call the Gothic Revival. Notice the symmetry is gone. We have returned to all those medieval informalities, and the steep roof, and the coupled chimneys, and the leaded glass windows. We've seen all that. New Bedford was the wealthiest town in Massachusetts at the height of the whaling era. It's the Roch family, who was probably the richest family in the richest city, needed a lot of houses for their growing family. And of course, they all built in the best of the Greek Revival, and many proud Greek revivals still survive in New Bedford, except for the black sheep of the family who went and fell in love with the Gothic Revival. This was William J. Roch, and he built the house, which is in all the architectural history books. This is a house all based on fashion and design. The floor plan is quite irregular. Another one, this is all a wood building with what we call flush board siding, and then painted to resemble sandstone. And here it is in Stratford, Vermont, and so the state of Vermont has seen fit to preserve it, complete with metal roof and so forth, and these wonderful finials and spires and so forth that a good Gothic Revival house will have. It was time for all the unfashionable federal houses to quickly update themselves. This is in Kennebunkport. This is called the Wedding Cake House. Well, this is all a confection in wood added to a federal house. The center entrance with the arched fanlight and the windows placed 2 on the right, 2 on the left. This is a very strict Palladian window, very strict essay in the federal. This is the Smith Winslow House in Warren, Rhode Island. The Italianate takes us back in a way to the Greek Revival. This is the center hall plan, but there are plenty of these that are side hall plans as well. But you see we're back to the geometric shape. We are not trying to imitate the classical temple anymore. As a matter of fact, these Italianates are identified by their very wide roof overhangs and usually a cupola at the top. But unlike the Gothic, they are symmetrical. The Gothic Revival are wonderful when you see them, but they didn't really catch on because they're very expensive to build, and they tend to get associated with elitist assumptions, and some folks that had wealth preferred the Italianate to look a little less ostentatious. But nevertheless, as the Civil War approaches, octagon comes into fashion. And most octagon houses built in the 1850s turn out to be in the Italianate style, which this is with the big brackets and the overhanging flat roof, only because Orson Squire Fowler created the concept of the concrete building. But the octagonal house was another one of his great emotional causes. And this one's in Maine. The great thing about the cupola on the top is it brings natural sunlight into the circular stair at the core of the house. This is the age of Currier and Ives. So I'm going to close with this print of a high-style Italianate house. You can see the symmetry is gone, and we are building the house around the center tower that kind of locks it together. And of course, fashionable ladies, lots of horticulture, gentlemen on horses.